Comix Zone is an odd little thing. The Sega Genesis had no shortage of beat-em-ups. Hell, a lot of the most popular games on it were Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, Altered Beast, but Comix Zone is one of the most unique. It was made by Sega Technical Institute, the American division of Sega that made a bunch of games, most notably Sonic 2, but also the cancelled Sonic Xtreme and some other rather large games, Sonic Spinball, Kid Chameleon, the Ooze. It's inspired by American comic books of the 90s, but also has some really cool stuff that other beat-em-ups of the era didn't. Comix Zone has also seen a lot of re-releases, as most Genesis games have at this point. A full-blown port to the Gameboy Advance, Steam, Xbox 360, PS3, iOS, and Android, plus being released in multiple collections like the Sonic Mega Collection only in Japan, as well as its enhanced re-release Mega Collection Plus in all regions as an unlockable, Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection, Sega Genesis Classics, and on dozens of clone consoles as well. While a lot of beat-em-ups were moving towards 2.5D, where positioning in a semi-3D environment takes precedence over actually being complex, Comix Zone strips that layer away to be purely 2D, but in return adds a lot of complexity to the actual fighting elements of the game, giving the protagonist Sketch a pretty wide selection of moves with different practical uses. A standard punch combo, crouching kick, low and high kicks that have their own combos, numerous different jumping kicks, a paper airplane that one-shots most enemies at the cost of some health, and a handful of power-ups that can be found in fixed locations, a screen nuke, single-use bombs and other weapons, and Sketch's pet rat who can distract enemies, pull levers, and even find hidden items. To compensate, enemies are also made fairly complex, especially starting in Chapter 2, where enemies will begin blocking repeated hits from the same height, requiring alternating between high and low kicks to throw them off, which is generally more effective in damage dealing anyway. Not that this makes the game any easier, as it can be incredibly fucking difficult. Enemies deal fairly low amounts of damage, but the game loves to lay bullshit traps that suck up health, mainly in the puzzle-focused sections, which are surprisingly common. Timing puzzles, using the pet rat to activate switches at a certain time, finding items that have specific uses, like dynamite to blow down doors that would hurt to remove, because, punching down a door would hurt. Or even weirder, more specific stuff. It even extends to the bosses. While they can be killed by just punching them, it's incredibly difficult to pull off because they hit so hard. Instead, they have small environmental things to drain them more quickly. The Spawn Mutant Queen has an explosive barrel on the far side of the room that can be pushed to her to knock off a bunch of health. Kung Fung's explosive nails stick to the walls and he can be repeatedly thrown into them for massive damage. And the final boss, Mortis, can be damaged by turning on the nuke's thruster while he's at the bottom to wipe him out incredibly quickly. It actually makes him more or less the easiest boss in the game. And this would all be fine and good if it wasn't a one life for the whole game type of deal. Thankfully, all 6 levels have level select codes and the levels themselves are fairly short, although Sketch is only healed after every other. I'd highly recommend using level select codes. The game is incredibly frustrating to learn without them, given it loves to bullshit you or kill you for not clinging onto a certain item, and really that's kind of the major strike against the game. The combat is great, and as I'll get to in a second, it looks really good for its time, but it really loves to pull some shit and waste that one life while playing legit. Aesthetics are where Comix Zone really shines. The music is kind of weird, I'll admit some of it is weirdly twangy and bluegrassy. I don't find it appealing despite liking the tinny synthetic stuff that the Genesis usually puts out. Everything else is great though. Starting off, the cutscenes are amazing for the time, the story is really simple. A comic artist has his creation come out and throw him into the comic book to attempt to gain freedom and take over the world, all shown with simple but really clean cutscenes. In fact, there's a surprising amount of additional story in the game, which was very rare for the time. During fights, or even sometimes before, characters, Sketch, villains, etc. will talk through speech bubbles, even making in-game cutscenes like the ones that would become popular in things like Half-Life, where the player can move around while speeches are happening. Some of them can be kind of lengthy, especially before the bosses, and they're not skippable. Given how hard the game can be, it can drag a bit, but it's a neat attempt at telling a story for the time. The best part of Comix Zones is that the game loves to play with the comic book aesthetic. It's bright and poppy, really colorful, but actually uses its format interestingly too. As opposed to something like Streets of Rage, where the screen will arbitrarily stop scrolling until all enemies are defeated, each panel is its own room and Sketch can jump to the next panel when they're gone, which allows tons of variety in environment. The panels can imply a jump in time and location. Each chapter, composed of 2 stages, also has its own rough theme. Night of the Mutants is sciencey labs and rivers of ooze, plus a bit of wasteland. Welcome to the Temple is snowy mountains and Hindu temples converted into Mortal Kombat tournament stages. And Curse of the Dead Ships is a ship graveyard and a nuclear submarine. I question the story of the in-universe comic that it plays out this way, but it's a very nice variety. The game also likes to play with the comic-y theme, branching paths occur in places where multiple panels are visible. Cracked panels can be shattered with attacks to move forward. The villain's hand can sometimes be seen drawing in new enemies. In the final boss area, since Sketch was thrown into the comic mid-drawing, the bottom corner is unfinished, just a rough uncovered sketch. It's neat in that it's both just a unique little detail that ties in the story, but also indicates that this is the end of the game. This is the last mostly finished page, there's nothing beyond this. There's also 2 endings depending on how fast the final boss is defeated, each with a brief unique cutscene. Really the only thing I don't like that much is the character design. Sketch himself especially is so 90s with the ponytail and fingerless gloves. It's actually a bit off-putting, while most of the enemies and bosses look like rejected Ninja Turtle enemies, and not in an incredibly appealing way. And Kung Fung is, the Fu Manchu thing was definitely still acceptable in the 90s, but, Well, I'd normally cover stages, I think I've said all I want there, so I'll kind of just cover some other stuff here. There was a tie-in comic for Comix Zone, like, of course there was, like, how could they not? It's just a brief 13-page retelling of the intro, where Mortis throws Sketch into the Comix Zone. It's a little more detailed and looks relatively nice, but there isn't much to it. The game also ends with a limp cliffhanger after the postscript that says, "The world is safe until..." And apparently a Comix Zone 3D was in the works but fell through, and the team that made it would branch away from Sega, pumping out a few licensed games under Activision, like Shrek 2 and Kung Fu Panda, as well as the fairly popular True Crime Streets of LA before being shuttered. Comix Zone is super close to being an all-time great, and in a lot of ways it is. The art and gameplay are fantastic, and when it isn't being a bitch, it's a lot of fun. There's surprising depth and complexity that most of its genre, especially at the time, lacked. Really the biggest knock against it is the difficulty. The game is short, each page is only 5 or 10 minutes, and there's only 6 of them. So to compensate, there's a lot of noob traps and blindsiding piled on to having to do the whole game in one life. I would recommend trying it for sure, the style alone makes it worthwhile, but I would also recommend using level select codes. Getting through it full legit is a patience-testing nightmare of memorizing multiple stage layouts, trial and erroring enemies and bosses, and even some weird RNG stuff like mystery items sometimes blowing up in your face. It's a game that deserves more love than it gets, but is too backbreaking for its own good.